Hello and welcome back to this video of the video series on KNX IP. Now we know the difference between a KNX IP router and a KNX IP interface. And we also know what KNX IP tunneling means and what KNX IP routing means. So therefore in this video we will see how we can implement a KNX IP router in our KNX project in the EDS5. And to show you the functionality of a KNX IP router, I have prepared a little demo board with the demo project. You can see on the upper side the KNX TP push button insert for 20 secure. This push button sensor is in line with the KNX IP BIOS 777 and a KNX IP Router 752 secure. Down below you can see the second line. In this line we can find a power supply 366 as well as a KNX IO 510, which is a switching actuator with 2 channels, and also another KNX IP Router 752 secure. And on the upper left side you can find a KNX IP multi-IO, which we won't use for now because we don't need it in this project. So now let us take a look at the EDS5 project. You can see that we have 2 lines, an indoor line and an outdoor line. In the indoor line we can see the KNX IO 510, so the switching actuator, and in the outdoor line we have the KNX TP push button insert. If we take a look at the group addresses, the functionality is going to be clear. So we want to switch the garden light with the push button insert. So therefore we here have our switching objects from the push button insert as well as the switching object from our switching actuator. However, in the state group address, we currently only have the state object of our actuator, so this group address shouldn't be routed to the other line. And we will check if this later on works. So the functionality we want to achieve is that with the push button insert on the outdoor line, we want to switch the first channel of the switching actuator in the indoor line. So now let us implement the KNX IP routers to our project. Therefore, let us first of all check if the settings of the area are correct. Because here we need to set the medium type of our main line to IP. Otherwise we wouldn't be able to add the IP routers. So now that this is checked, we can open up the catalogs page and search for our router that we want to add. So 752 secure, there we have it, and I will add it to the indoor line. And now it is asking me to set a project password. This is only necessary if we want to use the secure functionality, which I won't use for now, so I will skip it and will add the second IP router to the outer line. Same thing here, skipping the password settings. Now that this is done, we can find the IP routers added to our indoor line with the correct physical address, the 1.2.0 at the end. It is important that we have a 0 here. So now that this is done, we can take a look at the filter table. Therefore, right click on the IP router and here we can find preview filter table. And what we can see here are the group addresses which will pass through the IP router. So whenever the IP router sees a telegram addressed with this group address, it is going to convert the telegram either to the twisted pair side or to the IP side. Telegrams or group addresses which aren't listed here, well, they are going to be ignored by the IP router. So if we take a look at the filter table, we can see the switching group address is set correctly. However, the state group address isn't listed here because this group address isn't needed in the other line, so it doesn't need to be routed. Now let's just close this filter table and let us take a quick look at the parameters we can find. First of all, some general settings where we can enable or disable the programming mode via the front buttons, as well as we can set up the manual operation, so we can disable it or say if we want a time limit. And then much more interesting, here we have the routing settings. Now both pages look pretty similar but have some other options. First of all, these options here above are identical. We can specify if we want to filter the telegrams, if we want to block them, or if we want to route them always. However, since we want to use the IP router as a filter so that not every telegram is going to be sent to every line, we keep the default settings of filter all telegrams. So individual address telegrams are telegrams with a physical address. broadcast telegrams we can also specify to block or route, and down below here we can specify how acknowledged telegrams should be sent. Now the default values here are suited for the most cases, so we will keep them. The same applies to the second settings from IP to KNX. Here we have some additional settings towards the repetition of telegrams. But we will keep the default values as they will work for the most cases. So now everything is set up and we can start to program the IP routers. So in order to do that, I will switch to the bus page, ETS and then bus. And down below here we can already find the discovered interfaces. So what we can find now are 3 discovered interfaces. First of all, here's listed the network controller of our computer. And as you can see up above here, this is if we want to use IP routing. So whenever we want to program with IP routing, we specify this interface. Down below you can find the tunneling addresses of our IP routers. Because as I told you, the KNX IP routers also make available an IP tunneling interface, which we won't use because then we would have to change the interface whenever we want to program a device from the other line. So I will stick here to the IP routing interface, and now we could theoretically program our devices. And I said theoretically, because if we take a look here down below on the IP addresses of our IP routers, they don't look really right. And that is the case because we don't have a DHCP server in this network, so no normal router. And instead, because they couldn't found a DHCP server where they could get an IP address from, they assigned an auto IP to it. So before I want to program the devices, we will set up the correct IP address to these devices. Therefore, I will switch back into our project and I will click on the first IP router. And now the IP address I want to assign, I can do it under Properties IP, and I want to use a static IP address. Therefore, I will have to edit it here, and I will set it up 192.168.2.10, and the subnet mask I will change accordingly to that, so 255.255.255.0. And now the second IP router I will also change to static address, and now here I want 192.168.2.20, and also changing the subnet mask. So now with these settings I can start to program the devices. So first of all, the IP router download, full download. Now there are 2 methods to enable the programming mode of this IP router. I could either press both buttons at the front simultaneously, or I could press the button which is normally behind the cover of our cabinet. So now that the IP router is programming, I will start the download of the switching actuator. Now that everything has downloaded, we can check if the functionality is available. So I will open up the Diagnostics, and then I will turn on the light and turn it off. And as you can see, everything worked just fine. And we can also see that on the KNX IP side, because you can see also here we have specified the IP routing. So we look at the KNX IP side of our network. We can only see the telegrams from the push button sensor, so the switching telegrams, because they are needed in the other line, and so they went through the KNX IP side back to KNX twisted pair on the second line. However, the state telegram of our switching actuator isn't needed in the other line, so therefore they weren't routed to the KNX IP side. But remember, we have KNX IP tunneling addresses available from our routers, which we already saw. And if we now specify the tunneling address from the line where the switching actuator sits as our active interface, we will see every twisted pair telegram in this line. So therefore I will stop the diagnostics and come back here to EDS and under bus. Now the problem is we don't see the tunneling addresses available, and this is because the network parameters of our PC don't match the parameters of our tunneling devices. So in order to see them again, we first of all have to change the IP address of this computer. So therefore I will open up the network settings. So I have opened up my network settings, and down below I have my Ethernet connection. I will double click it, and then we should see this page. And please don't be confused because my PC is set to the German language. But down below here under configuration, we can go under TCP IP v4, double click it. And now here we can specify a static address. If we click down below, we can specify an address that we want to use. So in my case, 192.168.2, and then I will choose the address 100. Okay, close and close. And then we should see the interfaces shortly. And now you can see both IP routers are available, and we can see that they have the correct IP addresses. Please bear in mind that these settings that we just did with the network card settings, we only need them when we don't have a DHCP router available in our network. Otherwise, we would already have gotten an IP address by our DHCP server, which would be in the same range as the KNX IP routers. So now I can enable the IP tunneling interface from the correct line, so ensure that you have the IP tunneling activated as current interface, and it is from the correct line, so the line of the switching actuator in our case, because this is to the twisted pair line we want to take a look at. And so next up I will come back to EDS and start over again. And what we should now see are both telegrams. So as you can see, this just worked fine. We can see the telegram of the push button sensor, then the telegram of our switching actuator, push button sensor, and switching actuator. So if we take a look inside the line, we can see the telegrams, but not from outside, so on the KNX IP side, because they aren't routed. And this is how easily we can implement KNX IP routers into our network.